We are very pleased to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Jeff Kildea, who is an honorary professor of the Irish Studies at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Dr. Kildea received his PhD in 2001 and has since taken role of lecturer and researcher, specializing in the Irish in Australia and in World War I. Among his many notable works are Fearing the Fabrics, Sectarianism in Australia, 1910 to 1925, and Anzac and Ireland, which explore the relationship between Australian soldiers and Ireland during World War I.
His current research continues to shed light on the multicultural forces that have shaped Australian history, with a specific focus on how the Irish diaspora has influenced the nation's politics and cultural development. He has published several books and articles on the subject. Most recently, Sister Ligory, The Nun Who Divided a Nation, and More Than Mannix, Irish-Australian woman who helped defeat conscription in WW1, both published in 2024. We are very grateful to have him with us today, and we are excited for the insight he will share during his lecture, Asserting Their Identity, Sectarian, Rioting in Australia and the Celtic Irish. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jeff Kildea.
Bonjour à tous, merci à Noémie pour l'organisation de ce colloque et son hospitalité. That exhausts my French, and rather than butchering the language any further, I will now resort to my native tongue. In this era of rapid communication, barely a day passes when buzzwords such as culture wars, identity politics, hate speech, and cancel culture do not appear in the news feeds on our devices. Often they are accompanied by opinion pieces with earnest predictions of the imminent demise of democracy. Although such buzzwords are mostly the product of the late 20th century, they have only come into vogue in the past decade. Yet the lived experience, which they denote, has been with us ever since humans adopted forms of social organization. Psychological research shows that selective pressures have sculpted human minds to be tribal, and that tribal bias is a natural and nearly ineradicable feature of human cognition, and that no group, not even our own, is immune. In this lecture, I will look back to the 19th and early 20th centuries to examine instances of tribal or intergroup conflict under the rubric of sectarianism. That is, sectarianism between Catholics, mostly of Irish descent, and Protestants, mostly of British descent. It was a struggle in which each side was asserting its identity within the new society then being formed in the Southwest Pacific. Were such a conflict to occur today, it would be described as a culture war or as identity politics. Although Australia is generally and rightly regarded as a relatively stable country where civil disturbances are rare, it is also true that insurrections, rioting, and the breaking up of political meetings have been a feature of the country's history from the founding of the penal colony at Sydney Cove in 1788. Insurrections and rioting, such as at Castle Hill, the Castle Hill Rebellion of 1804, the Rum Rebellion of 1808, the Eureka Stockade of 1854, and the anti-Chinese riots at Laming Flat in 1860 to 61 are well known. There were also pitched battles between workers and police during industrial disputes, such as the shearers' strikes of the 1890s and the Melbourne police strike of 1923. Less well known is the spate of sectarian riots that occurred across the country in the 19th and early 20th centuries. While stories of sectarian riots in Belfast, Liverpool and Glasgow might come as no surprise, few would be aware that Australia too has a history of sectarian rioting. In fact, at least 20 such riots occurred between 1843 and 1922 across all 6 Australian colonies or states, some of them with fatal consequences. But first we need to consider what sectarianism means in the Australian context. When the first fleet arrived in Sydney in 1788, it brought not only convicts and their jailers, but also the baggage of centuries of religious hostility and ethnic antagonism. This baggage was the product of more than 600 years of English domination of Ireland and 250 years of religious schism following Henry VIII's withdrawal of English Christianity from the jurisdiction of Rome. As a result, Britain became predominantly Protestant, while Ireland largely remained Catholic. The combination of racial and religious difference between the Irish and the British was a potent mix that led to a series of wars and civil disturbances in both Ireland and Britain. And for the purposes of this lecture, the 2 most significant of these was the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and the Battle of the Diamond in 1795. The first occurred in County Meath, about 50 kilometres north of Dublin, when the Protestant King William III, formerly Prince William of Orange, whom Parliament in 1689 had proclaimed King of England, defeated and deposed Catholic King James II. William's victory ensured Protestant hegemony in both Britain and Ireland. It was a hegemony enforced by penal laws that would last into the 19th century. The so-called Battle of the Diamond was a sectarian affray near Loch Gall in County Armagh, in which the Protestant Peeper Day boys beat off members of a Catholic association known as the Defenders, leading to the establishment of the Loyal Orange Institution, also known as the Orange Order. Named in honour of William III, the Order's members pledged themselves to support the Protestant ascendancy, to oppose the fatal errors and doctrines of the Church of Rome, and to resist the extension of the Catholic Church's temporal power. From the 1840s, Protestant Irishmen from the north of Ireland formed lodges in the Australian colonies, and each year on the 12th of July, Orangemen would celebrate the anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne. Following the founding of the colony at Sydney Cove, it was not long before the antagonisms of the old world took root in the soil of the new. Reverend Samuel Marsden, an English-born magistrate known as the Flogging Parson, regarded the Irish as the most wild, ignorant and savage race that were ever favoured with the light of salvation. Marsden's stereotype took hold in the colony, where the Irish were often scorned as stupid, lazy, rebellious drunkards, and depicted in cartoon form with monkey-like features. Another antagonist of Australia's Irish Catholics was the Presbyterian Reverend John Dunmore Lang. Concerned at the influx of Irish Catholic immigrants under the government's assisted immigration scheme, Lang published in 1841 a pamphlet entitled The Question of Questions, or Is This Colony to be Transformed into a Province of the Popedom, in which he warned that the colony was being swamped by the shoals of Roman Catholic immigrants that are now pouring in upon us from the south and west of Ireland. He was not the only one to be concerned, as in our own day, immigration was then a hot-button issue. In 1840, the Sydney Herald told its readers, "This colony is flooded with ignorant and unskillful Irish Roman Catholics." Later, it warned, "In the course of a few years, the aggregation of papists may be made to outnumber the members of the Church of England, and that the overthrow of the Protestant constitution, as well as the exercise of Protestant worship, must be the eventual catastrophe. The question is whether we shall permit the Romish power to prosper and prevail, and to annihilate the Church of England, sweeping before it at the same time every class of Protestants also." What raised their concerns was the disproportionate number of Irish arriving under the government's assisted immigration schemes. Between 1837 and 1850, 49% of assisted immigrants arriving in the colony were Irish, and the vast majority of them were Catholics. Through the 19th century, the Irish made up a quarter to a third of immigrants to the Australian colonies, and of utmost concern was that the Irish were mostly Catholics, and Catholics were mostly Irish by birth or descent. So the Catholics were about a quarter of the population, a sizable minority. But a word of caution, while it is broadly true that in 19th and early 20th century Australia, to be Catholic was to be Irish and to be Irish was to be Catholic, it is nevertheless a generalisation. In his 1972 PhD thesis, historian Mark Lyons argued Catholics were very largely responsible for bringing hostility upon themselves. Much of that hostility was a reaction against Catholic sectarianism rather than the expression of an anti-Catholic predisposition. To Lyons, Australia was a new world in which there emerged a broad liberal movement with a clear vision of a harmonious colonial society, including an important anti-sectarian strand. Lyons charged that whatever conflict existed was largely a consequence of the rejection by Catholics of a social milieu that positively sought their assimilation and eschewed the bigotries of the old world. Recent research has tended to support an alternative view. Historian Geraldine Vaughan has marshalled much of that research in a recent book on anti-Catholicism in Britain, Canada, and Australia. Unlike Lyons, who regarded anti-Catholicism in Australia as the product of Catholic rejection of an anti-sectarian olive branch of colonial liberalism, Vaughan argues that anti-Catholicism was a multifaceted phenomenon with theological, political, social, and economic dimensions that existed throughout the British Empire because of an association between Protestantism and British identity. In other words, she contends, Catholics and their church were rejected on account of their un-Britishness. Vaughan also contends that Protestant anti-Catholicism increased through the 19th century as a reaction to growing Catholic assertiveness following the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. That act had repealed most of the remaining penal laws that had been enacted after 1690. Most significantly, the laws that had prevented Catholics from becoming members of Parliament or holding high office in government and the judiciary. As a result of their new status, Catholics in Britain and Ireland exhibited a resurgence in the political, social, and economic life of the country. As historian Neil Maddox notes, emboldened by their success, the Catholic population would no longer accept their position as the subject caste of Irish society. Over the course of the century, privileges that Protestants had hitherto taken for granted were torn away one by one. This stoked Protestant fears of a Roman threat to the British Constitution and to the Protestant state enshrined in the Act of Settlement of 1701. In Australia too, Protestants found cause for alarm. Fear of Irish insurrection was not far from Protestant concerns in the Australian colonies. During the Castle Hill Rebellion of 1804, some 200 convicts, mostly Irish, many of whom were transported for their part in the 1798 Rising, attempted to march on Parramatta and Sydney. Many of the miners at the Eureka Stockade were Irish, and their leader, Peter Lawler, was the brother of James Finton Lawler, one of the Young Ireland rebels. In the 1860s, the rise of revolutionary Fenianism in Ireland and amongst the Irish diaspora in the United States became a source of concern in Australia. This was especially so after the self-confessed Fenian Henry James O'Farrell attempted in 1868 to assassinate Prince Alfred at Clontarf on Sydney's Middle Harbour. The Fenian scare was as real to 19th century Australians as the fear of Islamic terrorism is to 21st century Australians after September 11 and the Bali bombing. It is against this background that we now turn to look at the sectarian riots that challenged Australia's social harmony in the 19th and early 20th centuries. As mentioned, at least 20 sectarian riots occurred between 1843 and 1922 across all 6 Australian colonies or states, some of them with fatal consequences. For the most part, these sectarian riots occurred in the context of Catholics of Irish descent reacting to what they regarded as provocations, either by Orangemen celebrating the anniversary of William III's victory at the Battle of the Boyne, or by ultra-Protestant preachers denigrating in public the beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church. Now, I'll now look at a few examples of the first type, which usually involved the display of banners depicting William III crossing the Boyne. To many Irish Catholics, this was a provocative act, as the Leader newspaper explained. To Catholic Irishmen, the picture has a deep and bitter significance. The figure of William crossing the Boyne means to Irishmen the final establishment of English domination, civil and religious, the beginning of a long period of cruel oppression on account of religious opinions. In the first example, there's a clash that took place in Melbourne on Monday, the 13th of July, 1846, outside the Pastoral Hotel in the city centre, when Orangemen, preparing to hold their 12th of July dinner, unfurled from the hotel's window a banner depicting William III crossing the Boyne. After the banner was unfurled, a large crowd began to assemble in the street outside the hotel. With hooting and jeering, the crowd demanded the removal of the banner. Then some young men started pelting it with stones. Others tried to enter the building. The Orangemen retaliated by firing on the crowd from the hotel, wounding several onlookers. The police intervened and arrested many on both sides. A similar event occurred 21 years later during celebrations marking Prince Alfred's visit to Melbourne in November 1867. An image of William III crossing the Boyne was displayed on the Protestant Hall in Stephen Street, now Exhibition Street. This prompted stone throwing and jeering, which were followed by shots fired from the building into the crowd, wounding several onlookers, including a 13-year-old boy who died a fortnight later of his wounds. Ironically, the boy was an English-born Protestant. In 1897 at Kildea and in 1901 at Boulder, both being towns in the goldfields of Western Australia, parades of Orangemen celebrating the 12th of July were attacked by mobs of Irish Catholics wielding hurley sticks, resulting in both cases in a general melee. The second type of provocation leading to sectarian rioting was ultra-Protestant preachers publicly denigrating the beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church. There are several examples of this, including in 1860 at Maitland in New South Wales, where a Presbyterian minister, Reverend William McIntyre, was prevented by a violent mob of Irish Catholics from delivering a lecture on the heathenism of popery. In 1866 in Sydney, where in what the newspapers called the Battle of York Street, a mob broke up a lecture at the Masonic Hall by another Scottish-born Presbyterian minister and Orangeman, Reverend John McGibbon, in which he identified the Catholic Church as the Antichrist in Scripture. In 1874, in Ipswich, Queensland, where a public lecture on Martin Luther by Irish-born Wesleyan minister and Orangeman Reverend David Porteous was broken up by a mob which then rampaged through the nearby streets. And the list goes on into the early 20th century. To sum up, during the 19th century, the Catholic Irish shared the vision of a harmonious colonial society freed from the bigotries of the old world. But what they sought was integration into that society, not assimilation. They resisted the pressure to conform to Englishness so as to retain their identity, particularly as expressed through their adherence to the Catholic religion. When they felt insulted by Orangemen flaunting their national humiliation on the anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne, or were offended by ultra-Protestant preachers denigrating their religious beliefs and practices, some reacted violently. While we rightly condemn the rioters and criticise those who provoked them, what emerged from this dialectic of sectarian conflict was a new identity that was uniquely Australian. As historian Patrick O'Farrell observed, the distinctive Australian identity was not born in the bush, nor at Anzac Cove. These were merely situations for its expression. No, it was born in Irishness, protesting against the extremes of Englishness. Sectarianism between Catholics and Protestants has all but disappeared from Australian society. Images of William III no longer have a deep and bitter significance for Australians of Irish descent, and terms such as the heathenism of popery and Antichrist are no longer hurled at Catholics. Even so, offensive or injurious language, which we now call hate speech, continues to exist in Australia, although it is now largely directed at people of other identities, sometimes with results similar to those I have discussed in this paper. As the author of Ecclesiastes states, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again, there is nothing new under the sun. Thus, there is utility in examining how our forebears faced the challenges of sectarian conflict, just as we in our day struggle to meet the challenges of intergroup conflict that we now call culture wars and identity politics.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for this brilliant paper. Do you have questions?
Thank you for this presentation. I had a question as you ended your presentation with the Grenoble riots, thinking about the 21st century. And I was thinking about the Bloody Sunday that occurred in Derry in the 70s. Do you think that it can be considered as a sectarian riot? And there is this notion of religion included in the riots?
Is it? I missed the last part.
With the notion of religion included in the riots
Okay.
that occurred in the Bloody Sunday.
Okay. I think the Bloody Sunday events that occurred in 1972 have to be looked at in a different context, because that occurred in the context of battle going on between the IRA and the British Army. And it was the British Army that shot those protesters. And so I think that is a different context. If you go back a few years before that to the beginning of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, NICRA, when it, for instance, had marches that went from Belfast to Derry on one occasion, and there that march was attacked by a Protestant mob assisted by the Northern Ireland Police at that stage, the B Specials, who were recruited basically from the Protestant community. Now, I could see that in the context of a sectarian affray or a sectarian riot, whereas I think Bloody Sunday, things had moved on in Northern Ireland from just pure sectarian battles to a bigger war where the IRA was endeavouring to liberate, in their sense, Northern Ireland from Britain. So I think we move into a different context. And in the 21st century in Australia was that picture of a riot that occurred in 2012 in Sydney with Muslims protesting against an anti-Muslim film. And I think that has more resonance to what I was talking about in 19th and early 20th century Australia, where a group feels that their basic identity is being challenged by others in a similar way to images of William III, or in this case, it was a film that was considered anti-Islamic, draws a reaction which becomes violent. And that's more of what I'm looking at, rather than what was a sort of more significant battle in terms of an attempt to obtain or an attempt to have the British removed from Northern Ireland.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I really appreciated the historical scape that you provided, Jeff, in your discussion on sectarianism in Australia. I couldn't help but think that when I was growing up in the Blue Mountains in the 1990s, it was at the tail end of, I don't know, there wasn't an overt sectarianism that we would have seen in earlier periods of the nation's history, but there was a tension between students that were from let's admit it, non-practicing Protestant households and those who were from nominally Catholic households. And I can recall in my public state school, this division that of along sectarian lines, along who went to Catholic instruction once a week and who went to the Protestant instruction once a week. And it's very interesting to think that maybe today that would have disappeared from, well, the instruction in state schools of religion is different now and it's bounded together with civics. But the end of your presentation, my thinking, my hypothesis is that it's even less today now, and almost to the point where students in primary schools would be insignificant. Any question as to who goes to the Protestant, who goes to the Catholic class. I think you touched on at the end. You left us hanging when you alluded to identity politics and different ways in which we we other people today.
Mm.
Could you expand a bit on your thinking, your recent thinking of how identity politics manifests in advanced Anglo-Saxon democracies like Australia? It's different in French contexts, as you might know. There's a rejection almost of wokisme and wokeism and identity politics in the French thinking. But I'm interested to as an Australian, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about how these divisions and othering people through identity politics can manifest, and what you might have to say about identity politics as a noble pursuit as well, or its origins in a noble pursuit of equality that have nevertheless today, according to some, been overtaken by a way of othering people who are often may have enjoyed positions of relative power in generalizing terms in society. And how do you see that playing out in Australia today? Leave it at that.
Well, Noemi, can you schedule another talk? I'll just briefly answer some of the points. I agree with you about the diminution of the Protestant Catholic sectarianism. I probably grew up on the tail end of it. When I went to school, in a Catholic family, I went to a Catholic school, and I thought there were two types of people. There were Catholics and publics, because non-Catholics tended to go to public schools. So that was sort of my upbringing. When I was a lawyer for most of my life. When I started in a law firm, I was told I was the first Catholic that law firm had ever employed. So that was in the early 70s. So it has diminished, and I think to the point where, because religion is not as important to people in the modern societies, it is not as an essential part of your identity as it used to be. For most of the people in Australia, you identified as either a Protestant or a Catholic, and it was a deep part of your identity. I think few people now would sort of see it as a deep part of their identity. It may be one of many identities for many people, but the idea that things have changed dramatically and for the good, it's ridiculous the way that people were carrying on, as I've demonstrated in those riots. And but the point I'm trying to make is that, as I say, nothing's new under the sun, that we just have a different word for it now. We call it identity politics or culture wars. I think there's a continuum, and I think it comes from that psychological research which I mentioned at the start, that there's this tribalism that we still have, even though we consider ourselves very enlightened people. We still, and I think it used the word ineradicable, something that we just can't get rid of from our human nature, that we do tend to form ourselves into tribes. Now, in some cases, it's harmless in the sense we might identify with a football team. And you may have seen some of those people from Melbourne, their passion for football. It's tribal, but that's harmless. But of course, there is still a sense of othering people. And in Australia today, it's not so much Protestants versus Catholics, more as people of religion sort of pulling together in their own circle, opposed to or being opposed by people who are non-religious. So that distinction between Catholics and Protestants may have gone, but there are other ones. In our country, there's a sort of a large and growing number of Muslims, and they are the ones that are the subject of much of that identity politics. But they are still a small percentage in Australia, whereas the Irish Catholics, as I was saying, is about 25% of the population. You couldn't mess with the Irish because they would, come back and fight hard, whereas other groups in our society in Australia find it difficult because they are only a very small minority. I hope that answers some of your questions.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you for your paper. It was really interesting. I have one question regarding the history of Ireland. You mentioned William III, but what about Cromwell?
Don't get me onto Cromwell.
Could you, well, is there a difference between what William III did in Ireland and Oliver Cromwell, the intervention of Cromwell in Ireland regarding sectarianism?
Yeah, I think it relates to two different times and two different sorts of wars that were going on. Cromwell was in the time of the wars that were going on in all parts of the, all three nations, the English, the Scots and the Irish. There was a moment of turmoil then, and the Irish had thrown in their lot, in a sense, with the Royalists, and so Cromwell goes to Ireland to put down any rebellion there against the parliamentary forces, and does terrible things to the Irish, and the Irish, even to this day, don't have a kind word to say about him. The Williamite wars are slightly different. The odd fact about that is that William III, in his battle against King James, William III had the support of the Pope, because it was sort of tied up with French versus English, and because the French were supporting James, and William was against James, and the relationship between the papacy and the French crown. I think it was a completely different situation. But what it did, it brought to an end in some ways the resistance that the Irish had to English domination, and so that the hegemony was then applied, and we get these penal laws, which then continued on into the 19th century, and they still exist today in some respects, because a Catholic cannot become the monarch in Britain. Still, sorry, nor can a Presbyterian. The penal laws applied to both Catholics and the nonconformist Protestants, the Presbyterians, and so the laws that with 1829 emancipation laws, that they didn't get rid of all of them, but they got rid of most, particularly important ones. Like you could now have people, Catholics and Presbyterians, joining and becoming members of Parliament.
I have a last question. Is it fine with you? So
You're the boss.
Were these sectarian riots happening in New Zealand too?
Yes, there were. That's not an area which I'm currently looking at, but in researching the sectarian riots in Australia, I have come across riots that were occurring in New Zealand. There's one in particular in Christchurch that I saw. So that it doesn't surprise me that there is this going on. Perhaps the practical difference is that in Australia, the Irish Catholics were a greater percentage of the population than they were in New Zealand. I think, say 25% for Australia, and I think it's something of the order of about 10% for New Zealand. Not Peter's close. A little bit more than that. A little bit more than that. But I'm right in saying in Australia it was a greater percentage. Yeah.
So they were not specific to Australia.
No, and in fact, that Geraldine Vaughan's book I refer to, it's across the British Empire.
Yes, that's
Canada,
the US.
in the US, and also in the US is slightly different, but because this was about the identification of Protestantism and the British Crown, which of course didn't occur in the United States. Yes. But across the British Empire, you've got these tensions between Catholics and Protestants, which Geraldine Vaughan associates with this identification between Protestantism and the British Crown.